There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn Breathes Books. Welcome back to my channel, and I'm here for the second installment of what I hope is a long and very popular and dramatic and entertaining series with the Canadian writer Christy Jordan-Fenton joining us from my living room. Hello, Christy.
Hello, Shawn.
Christy was my mystery guest about 6 or 8 months ago, and she said she'd like to do a series. She lives in Fort St. John, British Columbia, and she regularly goes on educational tours presenting about the middle grade novel that she co-wrote with her late mother-in-law, Margaret-Olemaun, Pokiak-Fenton, about Margaret's experience living in a residential school up north.
Yes.
Which is a fabulous work that I will have linked in the show notes. Christy is a writer and a reader extraordinaire. And so we're here to talk about some books she bought today, as well as books that jumped off my shelf at her that she thought we should have a chat about for your viewing pleasure. So, Christy, what would you like? How would you like to get started? You're going on another, Western Canadian tour with your workshops?
I am. I've been visiting schools from K to 12, as well as professional development. And I have so far gone across northern Alberta, then I skipped over Saskatchewan.
Flyover country.
Oh, well, I'll do it this week. But I skipped over Saskatchewan, and then I was in Manitoba for a little over a week, going as far north as Norway House and around Winnipeg and a few other areas. And now I am working my way back. So I'm in going into my third week, working my way back across Saskatchewan, and then one more stop in Alberta before I head home for a weekend. And from there will be some more Alberta, BC, Ontario, and Northwestern Ontario.
I will put a link in the show notes to Christy's webpage because there's information on how to book her at your school or your kid's school, so you should do so.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yes. And should we start with the book haul? Christy Jordan-Fenton's book haul.
So one of my favorite things to do when I get to Winnipeg or Saskatoon is to go to McNally Robinson, one of my very favorite bookstores. I think I have a favorite bookstore in every province. And
as one should.
Yeah. So the first thing I do when I get to a bookstore, even though I do have subscriptions to a number of literary magazines, but not all of them. So I hit up the literary magazines. So I got Event. My very favorite literary magazine, Prairie Fire, has probably helped to launch many Prairie writers and Canadian writers in general. I actually was published in Prairie Fire once, and it was my big claim to fame. It goes on every bio.
Absolutely.
And the New Quarterly.
And is that a Canadian one?
This one, I'm sure that it is.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm trying to think where it's out of. I have submitted there. Yeah, it's definitely Canadian. I know I've submitted things here, but I haven't been published in this one yet. It's on the bucket list. I'm quite interested in, I think, most of the work that I work on. Something comes up in some form or another about the prairies. I was born on the prairies. And even though I am in BC, fun fact, in northern BC, actually
very north,
further north than Norway House, I am in Fort St. John is still prairie. It's about the outer edge of, it goes into boreal forest, but it is, some of it is prairie. And I was born in Alberta, so folklore and superstition, the luck, lore, and worldviews of Prairie Homesteaders. I'm interested in
by Sandra Rollings-Magnusson.
Yes, and maybe they will have a story in there about what do they call it in Saskatchewan? It used to not be. We're coming up on Halloween. It used to not be trick or treat. It was Halloween apples. I believe that. That's what I've heard from old timers from Saskatchewan. They used to say ask for Halloween apples, I think.
Okay.
If any of your viewers out there know any of that Saskatchewan lore, please comment so we can learn some more.
We want to know, how do you like them Halloween apples?
So I got this one, Murdle, with some puzzles in it. I'm not 100% sure. I think it's like you have to figure out sort of like a mystery.
So it's a murder mystery in the form of kind of puzzles.
And puzzles, yes. And my youngest child and I, we really love things like that, puzzles and brain games and
J.T. Karber.
So I grabbed this one. It was a last minute impulse buy, but my youngest child and I had been thinking about this book before. So I am very very all over the place. My brain goes in many different directions.
I want to revise that. Goes in many fabulous
Oh,
directions.
thank you. Yeah, maybe on the neurospicy. And so
Neurospicy. It's my new favorite word.
So I love books about writing, even though I write, because sometimes they give me, it's like, oh, this is a fascinating new template to help me do something. So I thought this one might help me as I'm working on editing a few different works right now. And I like that it's broken down into, it will say like, now is characters, now is plot. Yeah, that's really helpful for me because I need to stick to one thing. I will start editing.
Let's get the title here. 7 drafts. Subtitle is Self-Edit Like a Pro, From Blank Page to Book by Allison K. Williams.
So when I start editing, maybe some of you are like this. Yeah, it's like when I'm cleaning my house, I'm like, oh, what's that over there? And then I get over there and I'm like, oh no, what's this? And I get very lost. So I thought this might keep me a little on track.
Are you sure you didn't choose it to go with your hair color?
Yeah, right, it matches. This one I'm very excited about. I got this for my child who happens to be trans. And this is about a young trans man who is a labor advocate. And I believe that it connects in with the West Virginia miners' uprising. There's some historical photos inside the cover pages. The cover art is absolutely gorgeous. This is called Compound Fracture by Andrew Joseph White.
And is this a YA novel or a novel?
I found it in the YA
okay.
section, in the LGBT
Okay,
plus
yeah.
section, which I was looking specifically to find something that my son might like. I was really drawn to this first from the cover, but the labor uprisings is something, oddly, that my son and I have talked a lot about, and the true history of rednecks. So for those who don't know, after World War I, a lot of the men who were part of labor uprising and organizing would wear their uniforms from World War I to distinguish themselves as veterans, and it got very difficult to tell who belonged on what side between those being hired to put down the labor movements and those involved in the labor movements. Wow. So the original rednecks wore red bandanas to set themselves apart as the labor organizers.
Wow.
So yeah, the red bandana attracted me right away, and the red bandana now is a symbol around the world. You will see where people are uprising and fighting for their rights that they use the red bandana. It's just a little bit ironic that when we think of rednecks, we think of people who are very socially conservative because the original rednecks were part of labor movement. So I'm very excited to dig into this book, but first I will let my son read it.
Well, let me know what the both of you think of it later on.
I will. And when I was at McNally Robinson today, the staff that were helping me staff there is always fabulous. They were quite excited. They loved the cover art. They pulled out their computer. They were trying to look up what else this cover artist has designed. And yeah, some fabulous artwork in books.
Another rabbit hole to fall down.
Yes, just yet another one.
That's great. So that's quite a haul. I have done a lot of book shopping in the last week too, but they're all coming in the mail.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it's not the same though. Sometimes I do order a lot online, but there's just something about going into a bookstore and especially an independent bookstore where things are still actually curated.
Yes.
And speaking of
so
books,
you have pulled some books off my shelf.
Yes, so the last time I was here, we were talking about maybe doing what's on Shawn's shelves.
Yes.
Because I love looking at people's bookshelves, and you have a very eclectic book tastes, as do I. So speaking of independent booksellers, we could start off with Louise Erdrich.
Yes.
This is a fabulous book. If any of you have seen me talk about other books before, you will know I really love sometimes non-linear, multi-POV, almost saga, but not super heavy saga, and this is definitely one of those books.
The Plague of Doves, yeah. It's one of my favorites by her, absolutely. Isn't it wonderful? Yeah.
It is. It's fascinating. I love all the characters that she fleshes out, and that they all have very diverse backgrounds. And even some of the unlikable characters, there's just always compassion shown. Like, she treats her characters with a lot of respect. And even characters that sometimes are not nice. When she writes sometimes about, for example, an abusive man, then later on, I love how she will go back and reveal maybe that character is at a younger age when they had more innocence and who they were, and then shows what the world did to them to then make them that unlikable character. So I really appreciate that. And this book is just so rich, full of history and relationships. And I almost feel like Louise Erdrich kind of writes a fictionalized version of not the history of the facts and figures, but the history of the relationships evolving through generations.
Yeah. And if you put that one down, I'm going to, before you go to the next one, you have a hot off the press review of her hot off the press book, The Mighty Red, right?
Yes.
Tell us.
Oh, yes. So it's very classic Louise Erdrich. I feel like The Sentence, brilliant book, but it was maybe a little bit different if you're quite used to some of her other books.
I think so.
It was a little bit different vein. And this is, again, very back into this multi-families, multi-generations, and how they're intertwined. And so if she's writing about the history of relationships, it's a very feminist side of that, but it's not in your face. It's very, very delicate and very subtle, but she's talking about things and stories that would stick in a woman's mind and that a woman would retell. And I have not seen very many female authors embrace that fully. Sometimes it feels like in order to be accepted, you have to kind of shut that part down a little bit, what's important to women, or you have to make it entirely your brand, like Margaret Atwood, for example. But Louise Erdrich just does it with such mastery. You just tell she's a master at craft. And I don't think even the most masculine man would be very offended, because she writes about some pretty masculine kind of happenings within that book, but the female perspective, it's just beautiful.
Yours is the first review I've heard, so I'm very excited.
Yes. It was good. I got it the day that it came out and literally binged immediately. So speaking of Indigenous authors, we have There on the Shelf. We decided to just leave it there where it was.
There is There.
There by Tommy Orange. Also very good. I love how it is showing different stories and perspectives all wound into each other.
Have you read his latest one? Wandering Stars?
I have. Yes, I have. Yes. I was going to say I hadn't, but I have.
Wandering Stars, I think.
I think it was Wandering Stars.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That was...
I loved it.
Incredibly, I felt some of it just broke your heart, but sometimes in a good way broke your heart.
Yeah.
It was wonderful.
I found that the historical stuff in the first half didn't work that way as much as the second half. And the second half was so good that I don't even care that I didn't think the first half was as strong. It was still like a 5-star read. I just loved it.
Yeah, see, I didn't mind the first half, but I also felt like the first half provided so much context.
It absolutely
to the
did.
second half. So.
It absolutely did.
And when it comes to telling different stories, I think it's interesting. I see this especially with Indigenous writers, but it's not exclusive to them, is where it could be many, and also I see this with Asian writers, where it can be many different perspectives woven into one continuous narrative, or sometimes people just outright break it down into short story collections. So Richard Van Camp's Moccasin Square Gardens, I finished this quite a while ago, probably when it first came out. And it's just wonderful, witty, humorous, very deep into, as well, relationships. Some of them are the more gentle side of things, some of them a lot heavier side of things, but it's all, whether it's light teenagers exploring love or it's somebody in some really deep trouble. I don't know. Richard Van Camp just really understands people. Anybody who's met him will know he's a very good people person. And I just love, the perspectives of the characters, and it's wonderful.
It's on my shelf. I think we might have talked about it the last time we were here, but that doesn't matter. People need to hear about it again, and if we didn't, then it's the first time. But I have to read that book.
Yes, I will never stop pushing this book or anything really by Richard Van Camp, who writes such a plethora of different books. And some people may know him from the movie The Lesser Blessed, which has starred Benjamin Bratt. I can't remember what streaming service it's on right now. Maybe Paramount, one of those. But yeah, it was great movie.
It's based on one of his novels?
Yes, The Lesser Blessed. And it's a really good book. So, yeah, I love Richard Van Camp's novels, and I am always going to support, especially Dene writers from the north, Helen Knott, who you've had as a guest.
Yeah. I haven't had
probably
her as a
talked about
guest,
before,
but
oh,
I'm going
okay.
to once I've read some of her
yes,
books.
You've met Helen Knott.
That's
though.
right.
Yeah, and Helen is...
She's on the GG
pretty much my...
finalist.
Yes, she is. I was so excited when I seen that.
With, what's it called? Becoming a Matriarch?
Yes. Yeah, with Becoming a Matriarch.
Yeah.
And, so she lives in the same community I live in, or I guess she's on the GG list now. I live in the same community she lives in. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of Dene writers from the north. Oh, this old classic.
And now for something completely different.
For something completely different. Bridge to Terabithia. First off, it was the movie that really connected to my oldest son when he was maybe like grade 2. And he was just so enthralled with it. So we took a long time and we read a little bit every night and had a big discussion and worked through. I wouldn't recommend this book for the average child in grade 2, but he was very obsessed with it.
Who's the author?
Katherine Paterson. What I love about this, what I really love most of the children's books that I am drawn to, is children's books that deal with really tough topics in very gentle ways. These two children meet and they end up in this sort of fantasy world, but a lot of that fantasy world is covering up some really dark stuff. The boy is very unhappy in his life. He doesn't really have the relationship with his father. His father is not able to have the relationship with him that he needs. And spoiler alert, so skip ahead a couple of seconds, but the young girl ends up dying in it, the friend. And young people do deal sometimes with death of a friend or a classmate. Yeah, it's just a beautiful, beautiful book. The movie is also...
When I mentioned on my channel that I'd never even heard of the book, I got so many commenters saying, "What's wrong with you? You haven't even read it? What's wrong?" And my friend Lindy, who's probably watching this video, she sent me her copy.
Oh,
so that's her copy.
This is her copy.
Yeah. I think that's right, Lindy, or maybe I got it at a thrift store. But anyway, I got it because Lindy scolded me.
Lindy was right.
Yes.
I really haven't read this one in a long time, but it did have an impact. And I think we actually, when my son got interested in this was shortly after I read The Little Prince to my children. And I had thought for my children that they were young enough that we would read The Little Prince and they would get like that one level of meaning. And my children really shocked me in getting the whole meaning. And it actually opened up some really good discussions around things like death. And I mean, we did live on a farm and my children had said goodbye to pets and animals and things. But yeah, so I guess we had a couple of months that were a little bit heavier reading. But I do not think... I think for adults, you should have a good idea of what your children can handle. And if you were really taking your time and having good discussions about it, I don't think there are a lot of topics that you can't explore. I mean, obviously there's some off the table, but things like death. When I do school visits, unfortunately, children, it's something I have to address. They ask why Margaret isn't at the school visits with me, and I have to discuss, explain to them that she passed away 3 years ago. And sometimes that will just organically lead into, even with like kindergarten, grade 1, them opening up about their own grief. And I find that it's probably not something that young children are given a huge amount of space to talk about. And adults think they're just going to get over it and move on, or they're so young that they don't really think about it. But had some phenomenally deep discussions around grief with young people, and wow, like the capacity young people have to process those things is actually inspirational. I think that young people have really helped me through my own grief. But
it's fascinating.
Yeah, and I guess kind of on that topic.
Okay, good segue.
Another one, and finally would love to bring up this one, or A Tale for the Time Being. And one thing I loved about this title is that when I first picked it up, I was thinking of the time being. It's like a phrase that we use, but it's actually, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but you'd have to read it and understand like time being is a noun, like.
And by Ruth Ozeki, yep.
It's really beautiful. I don't think it's a major theme of it, but there's something very intergenerational in it. It does explore the after of the major tsunami.
2011,
Yeah.
which I was living in Japan when it happened, yeah.
And it starts with a young girl, I believe, this has been a very long time since I've read this, but I believe it starts with a young girl finding a lunchbox with some
Something
items
that
in
traveled
it.
across the...
There's a diary in it of a really unhappy girl. But like one of the things that, and I'm hoping I'm putting it to the right book, maybe you can remind me, is that there's a talk of the markers that were put saying, and the people had the generations before had said never to build houses below those markers.
Oh, no.
But then the houses get built. And it just felt like, even though it was, I think it's a smaller part in the book, that when I read that, it kind of put the whole story in context, even though it was maybe a more subtle thing. That kind of message that we are handing down messages on and on. I feel like the girl who is probably passed, who's sent on her diary, that's like handing down a message. But I'm not 100% sure on all the details anymore, because I think I read this like when it very, very first came out. I was quite excited for it, so I probably read it immediately when it came out, and that might have been a while ago.
Well, to all of my viewers who have been haranguing me to read Ruth Ozeki, I've finally taken the first step to acquire the book. I still haven't read it, but I will get to it every time it comes up. And Shawn, you got to read Ruth Ozeki.
Yeah, well, and you've lived in Japan, so you might have some context around like how that tsunami has affected the people.
Yeah.
I find stories of things that have washed up or things that have been discovered afterwards. The metaphor of it, that any tragedy that happens to us, like a tragedy could happen to me here in Saskatchewan right now, but something of that radiates out, that butterfly effect, or that whatever happens to anybody anywhere in the world, we're ultimately all interconnected. And I think that was the interesting thing about, on the west coast of Canada, in BC, that there were things washing up. There were things washing up in like LA, for example, and
walls of houses and boats and things like that.
Soccer
And somebody's
balls.
motorcycle.
Yeah,
I don't know how that would have stayed afloat. It must have landed on top of something or inside something to float across the...
Yeah, and it's really haunting to think about that. So this is just a really interesting novel. Again, my details are a little bit fuzzy because it's been quite a while since I read it, but I remember being very, very moved, and it was one of those books where you sometimes, you set it down in your lap and you sit and think about it for a while and then move on some more, but really good book.
What are you reading now?
Oh, what am I reading now? I am working on one book. So I'm cheating. It's an audiobook because I'm traveling right now. So I am working through right now I Was a Teenage Slasher by Stephen Graham Jones.
Okay.
I am a very big fan of Stephen Graham Jones.
Okay. And he's an Indigenous writer.
Yes, he is. Blackfeet, who grew up in Texas, though, nowhere in Blackfoot or Blackfeet territory. He did The Only Good Indians is where I first started reading him. And My Heart is a Chainsaw. It's pretty popular. He's got a lot of books, and I've read most of them.
There's a bookish corner of Instagram, which we call Bookstagram. Mm-hmm. But there's a standalone app that is like Bookstagram, and it's called Litzy.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I've heard of it.
You've heard of it? And I've been on it for years. And Stephen Graham Jones was on it. I don't know if he still is. And he actually commented on many of my posts. And this was before he ever became a writer, or that I'd ever knew he was a writer.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah,
yes.
And this is many years ago. Like, we're talking 7 or 8 years ago. So.
Wow, that's really exciting.
Yeah.
I'm like so envious right now.
I kind of remember it was an Oliver Sacks book, and I was either a review of it or an excerpt from it, and he said, yeah, this sounds really interesting. And and then a few months later, he's a published writer. I had no idea.
Yes, and a professor of literature.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I could be wrong. It's probably creative writing, but it could be literature, like somewhere in that field. And I just absolutely love his work, like so much. I really love genre literary fiction, and I feel like what he does is like almost very high caliber literary fiction. The ending of My Heart is a Chainsaw, even though it's like a horror book, the ending of it was profound, very profound. Like, I think I bawled my eyes out. It was not my experience alone. Bawled my eyes out, and it was so absolutely moving, but I don't want to give it away.
Okay.
Yeah, he really is very masterful in getting across some very deep ideas, but also in a like just super entertaining way. So like My Heart is a Chainsaw is like basically it's like a slasher in a novel, but it came around to a conclusion where you're left bawling your eyes out and like gasping for breath.
Well, this is interesting. A lot of people who know me and even recent videos, but many of my videos where I talk about being a gatekeeper between literary fiction and genre fiction. So I'm open to what you're saying, but I very much am a different kind of reader. So that's why I've never read them.
Yeah, I find that really interesting though, because a lot of who we're considering to be the classic writers now were pulp writers. And they were turning out pulp in very genre ways.
In the Victorian era, you mean?
Oh yeah, like if, you think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, for example, is first science considered. I don't know if it is or not, but considered at least for the West, maybe the first science fiction, the first horror. Like it's a lot of things that are genre, but it's also, or Bram Stoker's Dracula. Like a lot of those are.
The concept of genre fiction and literary fiction is pretty modern. So yeah, looking back on 19th century literature, it doesn't really fit just for the reason you're saying. It's all a big mix of stuff.
Well, I would hate to think, and I've never been someone who's like really into like Jane Austen or like Bronte books. That's not really been what I've been drawn to. But my goodness, if they were tried to be published today, they would have those like cutesy kind of cartoon covers on them with the like
Bodice
bright
ripper.
colors, and it would be like sold as a bodice ripper, and we would miss out on all of the like appreciating the actual like literary genius that goes into that. And
Yes, well, what my rule of thumb is, if I like it, it's literary fiction.
yeah, I think that I'm like that too. But I would say Stephen Graham Jones, I think I'm not the only one who would consider him also literary fiction. He is very masterful at what he does, and he does dig deeper below the surface. It's not just
I've heard really good things about him. So
yeah, and I don't even find he describes things pretty well, but I don't find it like graphic in a way that is stomach turning or anything. I think the psychological fact of the horror that he explores is like the only good Indians. I feel like the big part. There's a few interesting scenes in there, but I feel like the big build is you kind of like I don't know, knowing what's coming, and as it gets closer and closer, and that is like where the real suspense and the real agony comes from. But I'm not someone who, I've tried very hard to read Stephen King, and I know lots of people love Stephen King, and that's wonderful. He's done a lot to get people involved in reading, but I would have a hard time sitting and reading a Stephen King book. I've never been able to successfully finish one, I don't think. But yeah, I could binge and re-binge everything Stephen Graham Jones has ever written many times.
very interesting. Well, you think you're going to be passing through town again in January, perhaps? So
Yes.
We'll stay tuned for another installment of, I think we'll probably call it, I mean, this one wasn't so much, what were we going to call this series? Something about
What's
shelf?
on Sean's shelf?
What's on Sean's shelf. So this one, I think we're just going to call it Christy and Shawn Talk Books, because that's really would apply. But yeah, stay tuned for another episode of Christy and Shawn Talk Books or What's on Sean's Shelf fairly soon. Thanks so much, Christy.
Oh, thank you.